Bem-vindos ao IMIP Educa Global. Nosso objetivo aqui é compreender diferentes concepções de saúde global e seus determinantes, identificando, discutindo e propondo soluções para alguns dos principais problemas de saúde que o mundo enfrenta hoje, fazendo a conexão entre o local e o global. A nossa convidada de hoje é Kate Pickett. A professora Kate Pickett é uma proeminente epidemiologista social britânica e professora da Universidade de York, na Inglaterra. A professora Pickett ganhou notoriedade global após a publicação, em parceria com o professor Richard Wilkinson, do livro O Nível: Por que uma sociedade mais igualitária é melhor para todos, publicado em 2009. Este livro foi considerado um dos livros mais influentes da década pela revista New Statesman e um dos 100 mais influentes do século pelo jornal The Guardian, da Inglaterra. Ele foi inclusive adaptado para um documentário dirigido por Catherine Drown, uma diretora e cineasta britânica, e lançado com o título, em 2015, com o título The Divide. A pesquisa de Kate geralmente se concentra nos determinantes sociais da saúde, mas ela também faz, além dessa abordagem multiprofissional e interdisciplinar, ela atua na defesa dos direitos e no ativismo político relacionado à saúde pública e justiça social. Por conta da sua obra, ela foi condecorada agora em 2023 com a chamada Ordem do Império Britânico. Então, essa é a nossa palestrante, nossa convidada de hoje. Eu vou mudar então agora para inglês, mas não se preocupem, nós teremos aqui as legendas com toda a conversa. So, now with you, Kate, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. We are extremely honored, and I have to say that I was, very nervous because after just reading a short version of your biography and in your academic achievements now, so I became nervous, and then I reminded myself that approachable, warm lady who came to Recife, who came to IMIP a while ago. Actually, she gave me a copy of the Spirit Level. This is the Portuguese copy. I still have it with, I don't lend it to anyone, and I have your autograph here. But just to show, I also have the Brazilian copy of that book. So, Kate, first of all, I would like you to discuss and perhaps tell us a little bit about, why about early influences and the reasons why you've decided to pursue a career in public health in the first place and in epidemiology.
Oh, yeah, it was quite a long journey. I started out as a student thinking that I was going to do something very, very different. I wanted to be an art historian. And I was lucky enough to go to Cambridge University, and they didn't teach the history of art until you were in the second or third year. So I had to do something else first. And I started to study archaeology and anthropology, and I actually fell in love with the biological anthropology. And that did include a tiny bit of epidemiology, but lots of other things as well: population genetics, human ecology, primatology, paleontology. And I really became a scientist. So it was a real change of direction for me, and I was lucky that they enabled me to do that. And then I went on to study nutritional sciences at Cornell University, because I saw that as a way of being able to do something useful in the world. And at the time I thought my future career would probably be focused on global nutrition, probably malnutrition. I was interested in those sorts of problems. And then living in America, I started to realize that a lot of the problems that I had thought of as being problems of the global south were right there on my doorstep. there were stunted children in America. There were children who were malnourished in various ways. There was, of course, a growing obesity problem at the same time. People didn't have access to healthcare in a way that I was used to back in Britain. And I started to be more concerned about those issues. So when I did my PhD, I wanted to do a doctorate in maternal and child health. And I remember going to talk to the woman who became my supervisor at University of California at Berkeley. And she said, no, you don't want to do maternal and child health. You want to do epidemiology. And I said, no, I don't want to do epidemiology. I think I was a bit intimidated by the maths and the statistics. And she said, it's a toolkit. If you learn epidemiology, then you've got the tools to study whatever interests you throughout your life. And she said that she had been very interested in maternal and child health when she was younger, but now she was really interested in the menopause. But she'd got the tools to be able to study what was interesting to her. And I'm very glad that I took her advice, because when I did start to study epidemiology, it did feel like I was being given the methods through which I could make a contribution to understanding what shaped the health of the population. It felt like a revelation to me. And Richard often describes it this way, Richard Wilkinson, with whom I live and work. He calls social epidemiology, he compares it to a microscope. So with a microscope, you focus in on the tiny things and you can see things. But he thinks of social epidemiology as like a social microscope. It lets you see patterns that you wouldn't see through any other lens. And it allows you to discover patterns in the population that are informative. So it was quite a winding journey for me, but always an interesting one.
Well, it's fantastic to hear that. So in different disciplines, different approaches, and that might explain why you can write with such a broad view of the phenomenon in epidemiology. So that explains a lot. And you spent some time in Chicago as well, didn't you?
I did. After my PhD, I went to the University of Chicago. I was there for 4 years as an assistant professor in their Department of Health Studies. And again, that was a very interdisciplinary place to be. There were sociologists, there were health economists, there were policy experts and statisticians. So that was a very fertile place to be working. There was always somebody to talk to with a different perspective on what you were doing. So that was a really good place to have my first academic post.
Well, fantastic. And again, going back, I mean, you studied nutritional science at Ithaca, in Cornell University, Ithaca, New York. So, and may I quote a phrase from the Brazilian doctor and social scientist Josué de Castro. You may have heard of him. He was the chairman of Food and Agriculture Organization and the author of the Geography of Hunger and Geopolitics of Hunger. And he would say, he was born in Recife, and he said that the favela of the Coelhos and Ilha do Leite, the place where I am at the moment, by the way, was his Sorbonne. Yeah, he studied everywhere, and he died in exile in Paris, teaching at Paris 8. But he said that that was his Sorbonne. That was the place where, you know, by looking at people living in malnourished and in the very difficult conditions. So he said at some point, half of humanity doesn't eat, and the other half does not sleep for fear of the one that does not eat. So in a sense, it's probably oversimplification to be as a strong component, but in a sense, it is related to the spirit level, isn't it?
It is, and it may not be an oversimplification of our future as we continue to push against our planetary boundaries. The stark differences between those who have and those who have not, I think, will become ever more apparent. And it will be water as well as food. It will be land that is available for agriculture. We're going to see so much change as the climate changes in what is possible for the support of human life, that we will see waves of migration. I'm sure we're going to see conflict. So that fear that he's talking about, I think, will be present, and it will grow. And this does, of course, relate to the work that we've done around socioeconomic inequality. We've always focused on income inequality because that's the best inequality measure. You don't get good measures of wealth inequality to compare different countries, mostly because the rich are very good at hiding their wealth and their assets, and assets are harder to count than income. But the two are very closely correlated, so the picture that we're seeing in relation to income inequality is the same as what we would see for wealth inequality in countries where the data are good. And what we find with inequality is that difference between rich and poor really matters for population level health and well-being and social relations within society. And it isn't just because of those at the bottom having fewer material resources. It is to do with how inequality affects relationships across the whole society. So we often say that when you have more inequality within a society, it's as if the social ladder gets steeper, but also as if the rungs on that ladder are further apart. So you've got a more polarized society. It's more materially polarized, and these days those at the bottom have very little and those at the top have a hugely unimaginable amount. But it's also to do with social distance. It's to do with the polarization of societies across that dimension and the social distances that causes, and the psychosocial impact of that on our health and well-being. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
Well, that was, I wouldn't expect less than that, because I think the point you make is actually at the core thesis of the spirit level, which is that is not only poverty. I mean, poverty is of course very important, but it's more than that. It's inequality. Yeah. So it's not the difference in absolute income, but relative income. Would you explore that a little bit more, please?
Sure, and it is to do with this psychosocial impact, and I think this is where it's helpful to have been trained as a social epidemiologist, because I think the key insights of social epidemiology over the past few decades have been about the importance of the psychosocial for health. So things like social support, things like friendship, things like social class itself, where you are in the social pyramid, all of that affects your individual health. So we know from experimental studies that having friends protects people from catching a cold virus if they're exposed to it in a laboratory setting. We know from observational studies that people who have friends are as protected from dying over a period of years as they would be more likely to die if they were smokers. So smoking and friendship are the same sort of strength, one negative and one protective. So if you smoke, you should certainly try and have a lot of friends. Maybe balance each other out. But all of those insights around social support, social capital, were coming out in the epidemiology. And then people were starting to understand those patterns through understanding the biology of chronic stress. So we've got a biological mechanism that explains why lacking social support or friends over a period of time would have this impact on the body. And I think all that Richard and I were adding was looking at this at a different scale, looking at this at a population scale and asking, what are the biggest stressors at a population health level? And it is the way that society is structured and these social distances between us. And it's fascinating, I think, to many of us that we have gradients in health, across an income distribution or across an education distribution or across a social class distribution. The health of those who are near the top isn't quite as good as those who are at the very top. So we get these gradients. It's always worse at the bottom. But even if you're in the, say, second most affluent group or the second most educated group, your health isn't quite as good as in the top group. And of course, that can't be to do with having insufficient money or having insufficient education. It's to do with something else. And so that social gradient is a clue that you need to be looking for something beyond the material, and that you need to be looking for a psychosocial explanation. And so I think the individually focused social epidemiology came together with the understanding of the biology of chronic stress, and then taking this wider social lens and looking at inequality across whole societies. Those are the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that come together, I think, in our work that we talk about in the spirit level.
Well, I find it fascinating that you've mentioned the biological effects of chronic stress in response for infectious diseases. As you know, I'm a pediatrician and an infectious disease physician as well. And so what I can understand from what you say, so the biological markers, and sometimes it's called inequality gets under the skin. I think this expression is so strong and so powerful, at the same time so true. But what you're saying is that actually stressed societies, societies who live in a permanent status of stress, as well as the biological body, they lack the ability to respond correctly to crisis, for instance. So if a body is infected and it needs to fight back the infection, if you are under chronic stress, you lose the ability to respond correctly to that, and then you die of infectious disease. So what you are saying is that society behaves in a kind of similar way.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And when we wrote the spirit level, we'd got a lot of evidence, which we present in the book, linking inequality to a whole range of different outcomes, and we could show that these effects were large. We could show that the affluent, the well-educated were affected as well as the poor. But we were theorizing, really, when we gave that sort of explanation about the psychosocial impact of inequality and the way it makes people feel. But since then, the evidence has simply grown stronger and stronger. And there was a particular study which I think was really important for us to see, came from Late and Whelan, colleagues in Ireland. And they looked at levels of anxiety about status. The levels of status anxiety in different populations in Europe. And what they found was that within a society, sure, the poor are more anxious about their status than the rich. There's a gradient, just as there is in health. But in a more unequal European country, everybody's more anxious about status than in a more equal one. So for us, that was a real confirmation that what we had suspected was happening was actually true. And so that evidence of how people feel about living in a more unequal society, and how those feelings and their awareness of it and their emotions about it all translate into these different outcomes, has become clearer over time.
I mean, just to make clear for everyone, and maybe those who haven't read yet the Spirit Level or the Au Niveau, it's important to say that your studies are predominantly based on high-income countries or regions or states in America, for instance, and the evidence was so good quality data, and the evidence was that this gradient is so. I mean, whoever reads the book and see the gradient in terms of what you just describing of almost every aspect that you look at. So it shows that it's a lot more than correlation. It's really something that it's. And I know that the book has received some criticism,
Sure.
looking at correlation, and I know that you've published further evidence and a robust evidence of that, and that actually was very important for policy change. But before going to policy change, I'd like you to once you've touched these items already, to go into the inner level, the other book, which unfortunately we don't have a Portuguese version yet, as far as I'm aware. But if inequality in the mind, myths of human nature, meritocracy, and class. Would you expand on that, please?
Yes, so in the inner level, I think we were really trying to take the argument further. So in part, we were trying to set out those ultimately biological explanations for the patterns that we'd shown in the spirit level. And those are to do with the biology of chronic stress. They are to do with how we perceive and feel about living in more unequal societies where relationships are more socially distant. So part of it was that. But we also wanted to get into why it is that so many societies have tolerated such high levels of inequality. And what we heard a lot of the time from people was, well, you can't do anything about inequality because that's just human nature. That's just the kind of way we have evolved. We are, by our very nature, competitive, out for ourselves, and that's why we have unequal societies. And actually, these societies are good for fostering the kinds of competition that create wealth and create opportunities. So there's lots of sort of ideas around inequality that we wanted to address. And what we are really showing in that book is that the kind of society we live in shapes the way our human nature is expressed, but it isn't a reflection of some innate human competitiveness, aggression that cannot be different. We've lived in every kind of society as human beings, from the most equal and egalitarian and cooperative to the most hierarchical and aggressive and competitive. We adapt to some extent to those environments. But the way, because we're so adaptable, we've got a whole suite of possible reactions to the kind of society we live in. So if we live in a very hierarchical society, sure, we can be competitive. But if we live in a more egalitarian society, sure, we can be cooperative. It just turns out that being in the more cooperative one, bringing out that side of our human nature, is better for our health and for our well-being. So we can do it. We are not innately shaped for inequality. We are often shaped by it. but we can choose to do things differently. And when we look at other ideas about inequalities, quite often the idea that people hold to justify inequality is that it's a sort of, what we're seeing is a sort of sorting mechanism. The most intelligent rise up, the most hardworking rise up. And that's also just not true. Again, it's the hierarchical society making it look as if we have different kinds of talents and capabilities, but actually it's the inequality that is often keeping down that possibility, that potential that all humans have. So we have unequal education systems that don't bring out the best of those lower down in society, or we have a lack of social mobility so that talent isn't rising to the top. So the inner level is about exploring those issues in more detail. I'm sorry it's not out in Portuguese yet, but let's hope that somebody decides to translate it at some point. What we are producing in summer, this coming summer 2024, is a 15-year update of the analyses in the spirit level. And that will be produced as a report, available online. Probably a much easier job for translation. Mostly it will be graphs, not too much text. And what we're doing there is saying, all right, well, 15 years on, does the picture still look the same? And it does, very much so. But we also bring in evidence around the links between inequality and environmental issues, and take things a step further as well.
Well, I look forward to reading that as soon as it comes out, and very soon I will go back to that and to ask you about your current projects and what you have been doing now and what you plan to do in the future. But before going there, I would like just to comment. And in the very end of the inner level, there is a list of different issues that might be, or there is evidence that they are influenced by inequality. And one of them caught my attention because one of the things I remember by going to York and seeing the daffodils, in the just before the medieval walls of York. Yeah, and daffodils are Narcissus, the Narciso, in Portuguese. So the myth of Narcissus, and actually there is evidence, and did you show there in the inner level that even narcissism is, yes, of course, is on the rise, and it's because of inequality. I found it amazing,
yeah.
Many different things, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the narcissism is an interesting one because what seems to happen in unequal societies is that some people are sort of overwhelmed by the pressure of that inequality, and they become depressed and anxious. But other people, it does seem to bring out this unhealthy egotism, these narcissistic tendencies as well. In a very unequal society, sociopaths and narcissists do quite well because they are more aggressive, more competitive. And then, of course, some people respond to the stresses of inequality through addiction, through overeating, through behaviors that I suppose express their distress. So you can go under, you can try to claw up that ladder, or you can go away and try and take your mind off it through substance use.
I see. It's amazing. And may I just switch a little bit subjects, and may I show a photograph? There we are.
Yeah.
We are just in front of the staircase of Pedro II Hospital, where we are at the moment, and I still had some hair there, and you were just there over here, and yeah. This was the fantastic group, the crowd of the Enrich, the the international research network of research into childhood inequalities, and I want to ask you, in terms of policy change and in terms of the situation of children worldwide, what has changed since that picture, which was taken more or less in 2011? So what has changed for the better or for the worse?
Well, it's been a tough decade for kids in many ways. I think at the start of that decade, we were seeing progress in many countries towards extension of healthcare, education, and other kinds of social security for children, and the situation improving on the world stage in lots of places. But then, of course, we had just had the global financial crisis at that point. And I think we thought that might help the world shift to more progressive kinds of economic policy and that things might get better. And it really didn't. Instead, we got a lot of countries responding with austerity. And that has been bad for children. Governments that chose austerity policies were often removing services that were really important for protecting the health and well-being of children, and particularly of poor children. And then, of course, we've had the pandemic. And for many children, that meant isolation from other children, but from family as well. It meant missing out on education and the social benefits of education as much as the learning, academic learning. It meant many children were exposed to the fear of losing family members or actually losing family members. It was just a terrible time, really, for children. It was a terrible time to be pregnant and to be bringing a child into the world. And we have a whole cohort of children who were born into very sort of isolated, socially isolated setting and didn't have the developmental opportunities that kids normally get in most of our societies to mix with other people. And then now we've got in many parts of the world a cost of living crisis on the back of the war in Ukraine. So it's not been a great time for children, and I think it's a very worrying time to think about their future as well. You know, if we think about threats to the environment, if we think about threats to the world of work, how are kids growing up today going to have secure livelihoods in a world of AI and a world of climate change? Lots on the horizon that I think probably helps to explain why we're not really seeing a strong recovery in terms of mental health after the pandemic. In terms of policy, often when I'm in an international meeting of some kind, I'm constantly shocked by how often children are not even spoken about. They're certainly not there, and that, you know, their voices are not being represented in many policy-making arenas in ways that we now understand we perhaps do need to be more inclusive of seldom heard voices among adults. We're not extending that yet to children, so their voices are often not present, but they're not being talked about either, and their futures are not really being considered in policy making. And yet, if we look at an example like Greta Thunberg, a child can change the way the whole world thinks about an issue. So I feel like we're really missing out on something by not including children's voices more in our policy making. So Bradford is a city in the north of England. It's a very proud city, but these days quite a poor city. It was based on manufacturing, and when manufacturing sort of disappeared in the UK, its economy declined. It had always had a lot of immigration over the decades, most recently in the latter part of the 20th century and beyond, from Pakistan. So now Bradford is a city where more than half the babies born there are of Pakistani origin. And because there is still a lot of migration in, lots of those children will have a parent or grandparent who is actually a migrant from Pakistan. So we have first, second, third generation Pakistani families. And Born in Bradford is a birth cohort study that is following all of the children who were born in Bradford in a 3-year period, around 2006 to 2010. So those kids are now growing up. They're teenagers now. They're in secondary school, and we continue to work and follow them. We have as well an additional new birth cohort that's still recruiting. The population has changed a bit since the first birth cohort was recruited. So we now have quite a lot of migrants from Eastern Europe, from North Africa as well. And then we have a new electronic birth cohort that just uses routine data. We ask mums who come into the hospital to consent for data linkage, and then we can follow them forever, we hope. So it's a rich set of cohort studies that are then a platform for various research projects. We have one around air pollution at the moment, others around physical activity, around food. But it's also a place where we can test interventions, see what works and what doesn't. So a lot of my current research is based there or linked to there. And more recently, actually, I've been working with colleagues across the whole of the north of England to try and understand the inequalities that persist for children growing up in the north compared to the south of England. So at the moment, I'm working on sort of multiple geographic levels, really. I'm still doing international comparative studies, but now looking at things regionally and then looking within a city. So lots of different projects going on. And of course, policy that affects children can happen at all of those levels, at the city level, at regional level, at national and international level. And through COVID, we worked in Bradford very closely with the authorities who were managing the pandemic to help them understand the social and economic impact of lockdown and what was going on during COVID, and the impact for children as well of being at home. And some of that was with colleagues from Enrich, from the photo you showed earlier. That network came together during the pandemic as well to try and understand what was happening in different countries for different children. So I think networking is really an important way in which we serve those children, is working with colleagues across the world to try and gain insights from each other about what might work. There's always somewhere in the world doing good things for kids. There are good examples of policy, of practice. There's just nowhere they're all happening together for children at the moment. There are places where more of those good things happen and places where fewer of those good things happen. But there are shining examples of community-led interventions, school-based interventions, local, regional policy that we can all learn from when we're in the right kind of networks to be able to see the kind of work that is going on.
Well, then it brings me to the point of you've you've crossed that bridge from academic world, or let's say pure academic world, and you cross the bridge, and you are a social activist as well, if I can say that. And I think it's very important as a former health manager of a city like Recife, and having spent some time at the Ministry of Health in Brasilia, and I find it fascinating that you are able to show strong evidence to inform policy making and decision making at the municipal or the local level, the regional level, and the global level. And I know that you are participating in commissions like the Greater Manchester, but also the EU in the which is headed in the Vatican, and then you also participate in the commission with the Club of Rome. So can you tell me about Kate Pickett as the social activist?
Well, it's in a long tradition in public health, isn't it, really? So, I mean, if you look back to the very earliest origins of public health and of epidemiology, people didn't just sit in their ivory towers studying things. John Snow didn't just sit there and figure out that bad water was causing cholera. He went and took the handle off the pump. And we've had major improvements in things like sanitation, employment conditions, ending child labor, improving people's lives, because public health researchers went out and did something. So that's what we do, really. And it is different to some academic disciplines where people think it's very important to be seen to be objective and not get involved in the outcomes of your research. But I think this is where I'm really lucky to live and work with Richard, actually, because Richard Wilkinson was a student at the London School of Economics at the time that Karl Popper was still teaching there. And Popper taught that your theories can be as biased as you like, really, they can come from anywhere, but as your methods are what have to be rigorous. As long as your methods are rigorous, your scientific process is rigorous, then where your theories come from, that's fine. They can come from your politics, they can come from your faith, they can come from your previous experience. And then what you do with that evidence is up to you. So I feel it's been an important journey, really, to have the courage of my convictions, really, and to take that research out into the world of policy, practice, politics. It's not always a comfortable place to be, but I think it's an important place to be. And at the moment I'm trying to write a new book about why governments don't take sufficient notice of the kinds of research that is produced constantly in our universities that actually would enable us to have a better society. And this is in health, it's in education, it's in crime punishment systems, it's in social care, in the environment. And, we fund a lot of research in our universities, often through taxpayers' money. Research projects get funded, results are produced, they have something to say of relevance to policymaking and politics, but those reports just get put on a shelf if they're even looked at in the first place. So I'm trying to sort of explore a bit why that is, but I'm also mostly just trying to bang my fist on the table and say, pay attention. We'll see how that goes.
And you've made, I mean, I'm one of the converted, if you wish, or, well, I didn't need too much to be converted, but I, because I had my own ideological thoughts before that. But I mean, having seen the evidence that you bring about in your publications has helped us a lot. And so thanks for doing that. And I think, if I may ask you, I mean, there's something amazing about your journey is that it is a love story, isn't it? I mean, a love story of a relationship with your partner and your husband and a lifelong partner and working partner and a love for epidemiology. That you said that word in the beginning. I'm just repeating it now.
Yes,
And
true.
you speak with so much of course rigorous methodological approaches but also you speak with so much love in your eyes. I mean, you can see your enthusiasm and your optimism despite all the problems that we face. I would like to invite you just to comment on that, and then perhaps tell us what you are planning to do. You've already given us a few spoilers. There is a book that is coming up, I think, in the recent future, which is Act Now, and I think it's for British public. I understand. So long question, lots of things. So please. please.
Well, I've talked about the update to the spirit level that we're bringing out this summer. Act Now is a book, really aimed at UK politicians to try and get them to do more progressive policy making. Lots of evidence in it, and that's written by a collective of authors. We have a general election this year, so we hope that we will have a new government who might want to be looking for new ideas. And the work in Bradford continues, of course. What gives me hope is that doing this kind of work, you do constantly meet people who want to make a difference. Sometimes you have to wait for them to be in the right position to use their political power. At the moment in the UK, I think many of our elected mayors of our bigger cities and city regions have got a lot of great ideas, and they have increasing amounts of devolved power. And they are looking for ideas. So that's a really great level to be working at the moment. And so I have a lot of hope, various kinds of connections that I've got there, that we can see some positive change. But the thing that gives me the most hope, I think, always are young people themselves. And I think we have a generation of young people growing up who have experienced the difficulties and challenges of the pandemic and are looking forward and seeing the challenges of their futures. But I think they face them with a passion to do things differently. And so I have great hope when I see young people being activists themselves or demanding change. And I think maybe they're going to surprise us and be a really influential generation that manages to tilt the world on its axis.
So any final messages to these youngsters that might be watching us in this episode?
Learn as much as you can, and then be bold in trying to demand change, to ask the questions of people in power, and to demand that they consider your rights and the rights of future generations to live in a better world. I think together we can do it.
Yeah, young in spirit and young in age. So everyone, I mean, I myself having this opportunity, Kate, to talk to you, if I may ask you by your first name, and it's just been so fascinating. And when I read your book, it was eye-opening, and of course, I had a kind of in a way, a fertile soil in my head to accept those ideas. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experience, your journey with us, and just an open space for you to say anything you want to conclude. Or
no, just thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me. It's been great to connect with you again, and to know that, you know, there are colleagues around the world who are all trying to work together for children and young people. It's been a nice opportunity. Thank you.
Chegamos ao fim deste fantástico episódio com a professora Kate Pickett, uma pesquisadora, uma epidemiologista social, que, como ela mesma disse, levantou-se da cadeira, atravessou as barreiras e foi lá e foi lutar pelas políticas públicas que pudessem promover mudança, né? Já que o pesquisador produz tanta evidência, que essas evidências possam ser utilizadas para promover mudança. Então, uma grande honra tê-la aqui no nosso Diálogos em Saúde Global. E se você gostou desse episódio, procura lá nas redes sociais do IMIP Educa, das nossas... lá no site, por exemplo, nós temos mais materiais gratuitos, além de cursos que farão toda a diferença na sua carreira. Muito obrigado pela sua audiência e até o próximo episódio.